Hello and welcome to Movers and Shakers. I'm Ken Miller, today joined by 5th District State Senator Jeff Pittman. Jeff, thank you very much for stopping by today.
Thank you, Ken. Once again, I love these sessions, and we're in the middle of session, but we're towards the end of it, so it's a great time.
And it's important, for people to hear from their senators and representatives, and I think this gives them an opportunity to, you don't have to invest that much time, but you can get a lot of information doing these videos. So I appreciate it as well. So the 2023 Kansas Legislative regular session ended in mid-April. We're recording this on April 20th. And the veto session, I think, is getting started here in the next few days, right?
Yep.
So from your perspective, what is the most consequential action state lawmakers have taken this year? And I guess I'm not including the budget, because you have to do that every time. But talk about maybe something that was very consequential that did involve, billions of dollars in budgetary consideration.
Sure. Well, I'll say this, that when I was out here before at the beginning of session, I talked about how important it was that we not fall for the trap of instantly going for big tax cuts. We saw what happened back in 2010, 2012, when those types of things were invoked. And we're at a point where we've come out of a cycle, and we do have a lot of cash on hand from federal stimulus and other programs. And we have to wait and see at least one more year, in my opinion. So I think there's a big success in the sense that, we'll talk about taxes, I'm sure, a little bit more, but that we haven't gone and done some drastic changes to the kind of ins and outs of the budget. We've maintained something that funded KDOT fully,
right?
Funded CAPERS, and added more money into CAPERS over the last session. So I think that's a really good thing. When I think about some of the monumental things that I think that we've done, over the last 6 months, maybe a little bit before that, I sent out a survey across all my constituents. And as you know, I go across Leavenworth, Fort Leavenworth, Basehor, Lansing, and Western Wyandotte.
Right.
And there's top two things I'll just say. One was, public education. Make sure we keep maintaining proper funding for that. Make sure we are educating our kids, especially after the pandemic. Second thing was property tax. Property tax was top of the list consistently on a lot of those things. And so over the last year, I've done a lot of research. One of the things about our state in Kansas is that the property tax methodology, the appraisal process, the percentages, all that is in the Constitution. So
your hands are tied.
The hands are somewhat tied.
Somewhat tied. Okay.
Somewhat tied. We have made progress there. As you know, the different local counties and cities, they have to, in order for them to be funded, they have property tax and sales tax as their primary venue, channel. So they do mill levies, and so that's not done by the legislature, but the evaluation process, et cetera. What we did, I had a bill out there, 1604, SCR 1604, that then got modeled into SCR, Senate Concurrent Resolution 1611, that passed the Senate. And what that does is it would allow, it would put into the Constitution, after this would go out to the people, a constitutional amendment, they have to vote on it, just like we've done other constitutional amendments, that would cap the appraisal at 4% raising increase year over year. And you say, well, why is that important? I know in my case, in my house, 1 year went up 15%, next year was up 40%, next year it's like 30%. And these double-digit increases are just hard to budget.
Right.
It's not that people I had complain about the absolute value of that tax. Nobody likes paying taxes, we can all admit that, but we see the need for it. But when it's increasing by double digits, there's something about that really makes people angry. And they don't, property value is going to increase.
Right.
That's a good thing, it's an investment in the future. But having the assessed value go up so much, it makes it very hard for people to plan on.
Right.
And having this pass, at least through the Senate, I think is a big win. We can talk about some of the other tax proposals that are out there, but for me, I think making that property tax relief for all citizens and having it something they can count on is a big win.
Let me ask you something, and I don't hear this when we discuss it, whether it's in front of a county commission, sitting here doing an interview.
Sure.
And this might be a good question for a real estate, maybe not just an agent, but somebody who runs a real estate company. I'm from the East Coast. I've lived on the West Coast. Is it finally time where areas of the Midwest or the Plains like where we live, are finally catching up in terms of the property value because of what the market deems is. You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
I mean, I know the house I live in would be at least 3 times its value or cost if it was on the east or west coast.
Absolutely.
So I mean, I feel kind of lucky and blessed that I've lived in that house up until this point. But you're right. I had a 40% increase in my property valuation last year, and it was 28% this
Yeah.
year. That's crazy. You can't budget for that.
You cannot.
So, but I didn't know if if that ever comes up when you're in the halls of the Senate or in Topeka. Are people just resigned to the fact of, you know what, we're finally catching up to the East and West Coast with these overinflated property values?
No, I don't think that's a feeling at all. I think that
Okay.
people recognize that Kansas has a good total cost of living when it compared to the East Coast and West Coast. We've got different sort of, family-oriented values that might be just a little different in perception.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that, we don't have the mountains, we don't have the oceans.
We don't have the number of people either.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so the valuations, I think I think in our area, we have to be very conscious, you and I and the folks up here in Northeast Kansas, because we are growing. Leavenworth County is gonna grow, and we're right next, we have the Panasonic plant come in.
Right.
We're right next to Kansas City, and it's growing south down, and the airport's still right here, it's been reconditioned, so it's not going, this is an area that will continue to be more and more attractive. I don't think it's an East Coast, West Coast thing so much as we are a center of growth in the state of Kansas. And, there are areas of rural Kansas that are not experiencing that. So it's just not a homogenization across all coasts and things. I think it's really, what's the economic activity, what's the desirability of living here, and where are you located according to, certain urban hubs and things like that.
Okay. We've spent a lot of time on this, but
Yeah.
just as far as the budget goes, and I think when we had our interview at the beginning of the session, we kind of joked, or maybe I joked and you kind of cringed, but it's like, this is kind of a weird situation for lawmakers in Topeka this year, and to a lesser extent last year. You're talking about budget surpluses, and it's so rare that so from that standpoint, give us a comment or two on the budget
Sure.
this year and the whole process.
Well, I'll say this, I'm super happy. I'm one of 9 senators on the Budget Committee in the Senate. And that's kind of it's an honor. I'll just say it like that. It's my first year on that committee itself. And what we're at is an agreement on the initial pass of the budget. We passed that out a couple weeks ago. The thing I don't like about that particular budget, it doesn't have state employee raises,
right?
which we can absolutely afford this year after they've gone through so much. It doesn't yet have the education budget in it, and that's a big miss right now. There's a lot of push to privatize public dollars into private schools, and there's a lot of tension in the legislature around that, and there's a constant push from the House Education Committee to basically continue pushing in that direction. And there were some very big bills where every kid would get $5,000 to go out, and spend how they want.
Voucher.
Basically,
Yeah.
And some other programs. And so that's been a big point of contention. So we're not quite there yet. Next week is veto session and the omnibus. Omnibus, that just is a big word for the final budget for
Everything.
the year. Everything.
Yeah.
And so we're still in negotiations there. There's a big temptation when the needs come in from, say, Department of Corrections, from different programs, maybe domestic violence programs, or any number of different, there's a big temptation, there are needs out there. So to approach that with a fiscally responsible attitude and look at it as a 5-year projection can be tough. And so there are, obviously there's a lot of legislators that fall in and say, well, we should spend what we have, and others that are like, we need to cut it all, cut the whole surplus.
Right.
So we're at a point where we've achieved a pretty good balance so far, but we're not out of the woods yet. There's still, what are we gonna do on our final budget over the next few weeks?
Okay. One of the phrases, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the tax cuts that we kind of danced around a little bit at the beginning of this interview, but the big phrase that we've heard in the last couple of weeks is flat tax. And I remember back to the days when Steve Forbes was running for president, that was his whole platform. It was about, we should have a flat tax. Okay, so let's discuss tax cuts. I know Governor Kelly for a long time had been pushing to help the folks afford their grocery bills, eliminating, and not just incrementally, but in one fell swoop, eliminating the state sales tax on food.
Correct.
Okay, so I've talked about a couple of these. Talk about overall the tax picture, maybe starting with that flat tax, since that's kind of been in the news recently.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many ideas out there looking at different types of tax cuts. You know, you can affect the sales tax on food. We can accelerate it. We could go all the way down so that the locals can't even have a tax on food. That's been proposed and voted on at least in one chamber, but blocked in another. There's the flat tax, which basically says everybody pays a percentage. Let's just say this out there, flat taxes have been shown to be regressive, meaning it affects the poor more than it affects the wealthy. And that's rough. It's not really a good tax cut for what I call the middle class here in Leavenworth, Lansing, or even, you know, getting up into the $100,000 to $120,000 range. It's not really giving that much relief at that point. The one that's been proposed, it gives a huge amount of relief to those making, you know, well into the 6 digits. And even into the 7 digits, because it takes that highest rate of 6.5 down for the most wealthy, down to whatever that flat tax rate is. And so, is it attractive? It's attractive because it's simple. It's deceptively simple. Is it something we should shoot for as a goal? One has to ask yourself, well, why do we need that as a goal? If it's only benefiting or primarily benefiting a certain class, is that really what that's what we're doing with this? And so I haven't been very supportive of a flat tax across the board, although I appreciate the simplicity of it.
Right.
And why people say, oh, I just want to know what my percentage is.
Right.
But that's not the case, because everybody knows all the different standard deductions, as well as other kinds of...
And the key to that is, what do you set that flat tax rate at?
Yeah.
That's the key.
Once you decide on that, then
Right.
And look, we've gone through some major income tax. I did not get the message when I did my surveys, when I put that out there, that income tax was the primary concern out there. And so one has to ask oneself, well, why are we messing with it this year when we don't really have to be?
Right.
You know, unless we're somehow giving more of that money back to all of our citizens in an equal and proportional way, why would we do that this year in particular? Well, we can focus on some of the issues like the property tax valuation and maybe that sales tax on food. That'll help out the people who are going through these hard times with groceries and the inflation being what it is.
Right. Okay, getting away from budgets and taxes, another one of the issues that I think for the portion of the legislative session that I really paid attention to is the transgender sports ban. Saw that in headlines all the time this session. So explain the path that issue took, and I think it's a little unclear where it ended up, or maybe I just missed it, but where did we end up on that issue?
Well, it's in law now. So basically, the transgender athlete bill, look, I'll state my point up front is, I believe we should keep our women's competitive sports competitive. And competitive with women, those sports are currently regulated by CASA, which is the high school regulation.
High School Sports
and
Association.
NCAA.
Right.
It's an issue that has a lot of intricacies depending on the sport you're in, depending on levels of testosterone and these types of things. But as you get more and more competitive, I fully believe we should keep those primarily focused on the women. The problem with these bills, though, is it's a flat brush. It's a broad stroke brush. It says, oh, we're just going to ban all trans from these sports. And I don't like it because it goes all the way down to the kindergarten level. It's so broad and wide-reaching, and eventually, in the initial bills, what really got me was they had things like the genitalia checking, which is just, are you kidding me?
Right.
We're going to do that out there with these elementary kids, and it just seemed ridiculous to me. Okay, I'll put that out there. If we could have come up with some kind of a compromise and said, hey, we're going to take out the elementary kids out of this and maybe come up with some kind of a testing regimen that supports what the CASA is doing and gives some stricter kind of, absolutely, maybe we could look at that, but there was no appetite to budge on any of that really. So that was difficult, very difficult, and I mean, you can't help but notice that it's like 1 to 3 kids across a population of like,
That's what I was going to ask. It's not affecting that many kids,
maybe 100,000 kids out there, and And it just seemed like overkill on an issue that wasn't hitting Kansas. And when it goes down to that elementary level, it was just so hard to support, you know. Where we ended up was it's in the law. There was an attempt to override it, and to override the governor's veto, and that succeeded. So it's now in the law. And you know, we've had a spat of suicides in high school around my district this year and over last year too. And this trans population is very vulnerable. They're like, I can't remember the stat. I want to say 5 times more likely. That might be a little over exaggeration, but to be contemplating suicide or actually trying to attempt suicide. So I think that we should be a bit more sensitive to the issue than we are being with this kind of broad stroke banning of everything up through K through up above that. So it's a difficult one.
Right. And just to get back to something you said, and I know I had read it, I wasn't sure, but it was something along the lines of there are 3, I think it was at the high school level maybe, but there were 3 kids total in the state of Kansas that this would affect in terms of prohibiting them from playing the sport.
Right.
Is that
Yeah.
sound, okay, yeah. So I'm not a huge part of the population, but as you say, a broad stroke brush starts to affect more people within the issue, but not in sports.
Right.
So, okay. All right, Medicaid and medical marijuana. So those 2 issues, I mean, I know where they ended up, but they were discussed somewhat. I know the governor has made a point on Medicaid for many sessions now moving forward. Let's start with Medicaid. Where are we at with, I know where we're at with that. How do we remain there?
Sure. So right now we're like one of 10 states that haven't expanded Medicaid out to a population. We're at like, we give Medicaid benefits to folks who, I think it's 25-30% of the federal poverty level. Expansion would allow this to go up to the federal poverty level and a little bit more, and allow single adults who are working. This becomes a workforce development issue in my mind, where our local businesses might not be able to afford benefits for some of these workers. You know, if you have these low-end, low-wage workers, having the ability to have some health care and have that wage helps the small businesses keep employees here in our local Leavenworth, Lansing base or community. So I think of that, but it is not progressing this year. We had in the budget, there was actually a carrot, if you will, from the federal government that we could have reduced our budget spending by $70 million by expanding Medicaid, because they would put in more federal dollars to handle the Medicaid load. And that would happen over the next 2 years, but because of those opponents out there, that went away, and so we effectively have to spend $70 million more out of state coffers to do everything that we're doing. It seems to make sense that we've lost out on a good $6 billion by now by not expanding Medicaid here in the state of Kansas. Taxes that we've already paid to the federal government. I think it's high time we do it. It's still not. It doesn't seem to be progressing this year at all. I did make an amendment, a suggestion during the budget proceedings to do that, to expand Medicaid, and it would have paid for itself and the state employee raises. But unfortunately, that fell below the majority needed to do that. As far as medical marijuana, it's been tabled. I mean, I think it's no secret that the Senate President had tabled a bill that had passed the House last year, and put it into a committee that never met. There was another bill that came through this year. It got tabled again. Now I'm working with some folks on maybe a different angle to go with. Maybe we focus more on, if we're not going to be, if the powers that be in terms of the majority party are not willing to expand, or not expand Medicaid, but legalize medical marijuana at a minimum. Maybe there's some other methods we can go down. Maybe we can look at delivery mechanisms. Maybe we can make it through a pharmaceutical outlet. Be a bit more controlled about that. And that might be more maybe that's a start. But we got to look across at each of our neighbor states and see how, even though Oklahoma did say they don't want recreational, they did lean into medical marijuana. Missouri's obviously making a lot of money on their tax base over there, and you got to say, what are we doing here in Kansas?
Right. Okay. All right. Lastly, any issues that you can enlighten us on that maybe flew under the radar, and maybe not affecting the entire state, because I know there are sometimes regional issues that the legislature has to pick up. What do you got for us on those?
I got a few things. I'll start with one. It's Senate Bill, I think it's what is it, 34, has to do with housing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a housing incentive, affordable housing incentives. And we had put something in place last year. It was a rural housing initiative incentive program. And what it does is it incentivizes developers to build affordable housing. Not unlimited, it's capped. You have to have certain population
In
sizes.
rural areas?
Last
or
year's
anywhere?
was rural.
Okay, last year's. Was
So it's really restricted in terms of population. What we've done this year is expand it out, and I was able to, in the committee, amend it so that Leavenworth County numbers, as well as cities, have access to that money.
Mm-hmm.
And there are tax credits for those developers. They build out the houses, and eventually those houses come into the tax base of that city. And importantly, as we expand out and have workforce needs in Panasonic, in our local business development efforts, we're gonna have workers that can live there. It's part of the
Mm-hmm.
challenge with workforce. So I was pretty excited about that.
Mm-hmm.
And bringing Leavenworth into it, that was pretty exciting. I got 3 bills through with my name on them.
Okay.
One is still yet to be sent to the governor. 2 have been. One is a small thing. It's a Buffalo Soldier license plate,
Mm-hmm.
and it is about remembering and understanding the role of the African American in our American military, particularly the Buffalo Soldiers that start out here, Fort Leavenworth. All that money goes to the Richard Allen Cultural Center here
Mm-hmm.
locally that helps tell the story, as well as the Frontier Museum that might be is being established outside of Fort Leavenworth. Second bill was the military kid in-state tuition.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a military kid. I don't know, were you a military kid?
No.
No. But there's a lot of military kids out here. And I know that, for example, when I would move, for example, from Kansas to Alabama or Alabama to Georgia or overseas, if I had established a community here as a kid, I might want to return to the state.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, once you move away in the military, you start paying out-of-state tuition. This is just, from my personal experiences, I got a bipartisan sponsorship, and we say, hey, kids, welcome home,
Mm-hmm.
for all those dependents out there. So I think that's something that'll be impactful for a number of folks that used to live here or maybe went to CGSC. Third one is a sports doctor bill. So this is a weird one.
Okay.
But a local doctor, Dr. Yudlinski, came to me and said, hey, you know what? When team doctors come in, let's say the Chiefs came over here and they were playing some kind of exhibition game, their doctor technically can't work on their team members.
While in state here.
Right? They're not certified,
Mhm.
right? And we're one of 4 states where that was the case. I had no idea.
Right.
So I went out and once again got bipartisan support. We had 3 sponsors on this one and worked it through the process, and it should be coming through. It hasn't been voted on and finalized in the Senate, but it's sitting there ready to go. I've been sure we're going to vote on it and be sent to the governor. It's got some other things that have been added into it that are really nice, but pretty proud about that. So that when we have teams coming in here for Sporting KC,
Mhm.
for other events coming in, and even the high school sports where they have team doctors or team chiropractics, they can put in that quick application and they get that temporary certification for the event itself, just to work on those kids. So those are pretty low on the radar.
Yeah.
But hey, I'm pretty happy about it. It's like
Right.
sometimes you're working towards
Well,
positive things out there.
it might serve a small community need, but it's serving a need. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, I've been speaking with 5th District State Senator Jeff Pittman. For Movers and Shakers, I'm Ken Miller.